I guess I haven't met everyone on the panel, but nice to meet everybody. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
So I attended some sessions yesterday, not as a host, but or participant, just as a guest, and I didn't have video capabilities. So I don't know if as people come in, if you're going to actually see them or not. That may just give you a heads up. I don't know if anyone has hosted.
Yeah, I
yet.
don't think because it's a webinar,
Okay.
we won't be able to see participants. I think they can see all the panelists. We won't be able to see them. And
Okay.
I think the main way they communicate with us is through the Q&A box.
Okay. Yeah, that's what
So they
I.
won't have audio either. There's a thing on the top that says start webinar. I don't know if support is going to click that, or I don't know if anyone else sees that, but
Yeah, I
it
see
says
that.
people can't join until we start the webinar. But yeah, I was in 2 yesterday. We could only see panelists.
And there's something that has to be done to activate the chat as well, is it? I remember seeing something in the instructions that was a choice, but that the support person can, that we can say whether chat is enabled. And then when people join,
The chat option will not be utilized by the attendees. They have to use the Q&A part. So you'll see the Q&A if they have questions and then answer them there. the chat will only be utilized for like you guys to chat with me or me to chat with you guys.
Yeah, if you open the chat, actually you can see that she's telling us that it's gonna start in a few minutes, the session. So I think she's logging us in and then turning off the session.
Perry, what order are we going in?
Yeah, so we're going to go in the order that's listed in the program. So first would be Roberto, and then Maria, and then Gary is going third. So it'd be third up for discussant. So we're going to do presentation, discussant back to back, and then I'll be going last. So there was a fifth paper that's at the end of the program, but she had to pull out, so it's only going to be the four of us.
And then what are the time? What time frame do we have given that adjustment? Or
Yeah, so it's going to be 15 minutes per presentation and then 10 minutes, give or take, for discussant comments. We're going to leave all the remainder at the end. So if you have longer or shorter, it's fine to keep it shorter, however you wish. And the only timing I will give you is 3 minutes left if you're running late, unless you don't want me to do that, then I don't have to, but otherwise I'll just give you a heads up. All right, it's 10 a.m. I'm getting the cue to start now. So welcome everybody. This is the session on aging and race. It's hosted by the AEA Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economics Profession, often referred to as CIMGEP. I'm Perry Singleton at Syracuse University. I'll be the chair of the session, and I am also a member of the AEA Committee. Two program adjustments, Patrick Button and Engi Saidan will not be here today. So we have, I will step in as a discussant for the first paper, and then we only have four presentations this morning. We're gonna do 15 minutes per presentation, 10 minutes for discussants. We're gonna do these back to back and leave all the questions for all the four presentations at the very end of the session. If you have questions, you need to type them in the Q&A box. So you can see that at the bottom of the screen. What I would suggest you to do is to indicate who the question is to, followed by the actual question. And so that at the end of the session, we can just go through that chat box and address any questions you guys may have. All right, so the first presentation is going to be by Roberto. It's a paper by Joanna and Roberto.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, I can see.
Great. So today I'm going to talk about our project Age and the Labor Market for Hispanics in the United States. This is joint work with Joanna, who is also here and is probably going to help me answer questions in the chat. And going into the details. As a motivation, the Hispanic population in the United States has been steadily growing over time. And this is true both for foreign-born Hispanics and native-born Hispanics. And it's also true that age of Hispanics in the US has been steadily increasing over time. So there's an open question of what's going on to Hispanics in terms of the labor market outcomes as they get older. And we have reasons to believe they may be doing better. For instance, less educated white Hispanics have higher employment and labor force participation than less educated white non-Hispanics. But we also have reasons to think they may be doing worse. For example, Hispanic men have lower earning trajectories than non-Hispanic men. Hispanic people are more likely than other groups to live in poverty in old age. Hispanic people have lower Social Security receipts, and they have a higher risk of being work disabled at younger ages. So it's an important question to trace employment patterns and discrimination by age for Hispanics, and that's what we're going to try to do in this paper. Here we're going to focus on high school graduates only that represents more than 50% of Hispanics in the US. This also means that we're not going to be able to speak about what's happening for less educated Hispanics and more educated Hispanics. That's a growing share of the Hispanic population in the US. And we're going to address this question in 3 parts. First, we're going to look at the census ACS by age and Hispanic status over time to see if we can find some patterns that can tell us if Hispanics are faring better or worse as they get older. The problem here is that what means Hispanic is not necessarily consistent over time. This is affected by citizen status, xenophobia, and other issues that affect how people answer these surveys. And it's also affected by changes in the questionnaire and coding of these surveys. So we don't have a consistent measure of Hispanic necessarily in this data. Also, using observational data, we cannot speak about discrimination and if that is affecting Hispanics as they get older. So to address these issues, we're going to reanalyze first 2 previous experiments that use students and HR manager samples. In these experiments, we compare resume ratings for high school educated clerical applicants with Hispanic and non-Hispanic last names. The limitation here is that we only have Hispanic last names. We don't have Hispanic first names. So on the one hand, the Hispanic signal might be weaker. And on the other hand, there's a difference between a last name and a first name. A first name signals a choice that could be different than a last name. So to address these limitations, we are going to move to MTurk, where we have people rate resumes for high school educated clerical applicants, and we have a larger sample that can answer these questions. So going to the census ACS data, basically here, we don't see large differences between Hispanics and non-Hispanics in terms of labor market outcomes. There are some patterns here, some slight differences, but nothing major going on. And if we move to job flows, the same is true here. Again, we see some differences, but nothing too large. For example, the probability of job accession conditional of being unemployed tends to be larger for Hispanics and non-Hispanics all the way up to age 60. And the probability of job accession conditional of not working is higher for Hispanics across the entire age range. But again, there's nothing major going on here. Going to characteristics that might affect labor market outcomes, again, we see some differences, but nothing completely larger that could point to a problem here. And that's also true if we move to characteristics more related to employability. Hispanics are more likely to live in a metropolitan area. They are less likely to speak English, although here the gap is around 8 percentage points, so that's not too big. There are not large differences in access to a vehicle. There are some differences for older Hispanics, but nothing too large. And there are not large differences in access to the internet, which has become very important in the last year. So in summary, there are no clear patterns by Hispanic status and age among the high school educated graduate population in the census ACS data. So we're going to move to the experimental data. The previous experiments are 2 laboratory experiments in which we showed 40 randomized resumes for a clerical position. Here we asked participants to rate resumes on a 1 through 7 Likert scale, where 1 is worst quality and 7 is the best applicant that we could have. The key feature of the experiments is that we use eye tracking devices, so we can actually check to which parts of the resumes participants are paying attention. We use high school gradation dates to signal age, and Hispanic status is signaled only by the last name, as I mentioned before. So going to the results, in the student sample, we don't see significant differences in ratings for Hispanics and non-Hispanics across age. The confidence intervals overlap, and there are no large differences in the mean ratings. And the same is true if we move to the HR sample. Again, confidence intervals overlap, and there are not major differences in the mean ratings between Hispanics and non-Hispanics. So the bottom line here is that students and HR samples treat Hispanics and non-Hispanic resumes very similarly across age. And this is in a large contrast to earlier results comparing Black versus non-Black first names, there we could find large differences and evidence of discrimination. So here, as I mentioned before, it may be that Hispanic last names don't signal Hispanic in the same way that a Hispanic first name would do. As I mentioned before, on the one hand, the signal could be weaker if we are not using first names. And also, a first name signals something different. It signals a choice, which could be elicit different responses from participants. Another limitation here is that these experiments are not set up to test stereotypes about Hispanics. So we cannot explore what could be affecting ratings for Hispanics here. So to address these limitations, we move to MTurk and we run our MTurk experiment. I'm going to focus here for this presentation. We recruited participants in Amazon's MTurk. We recruited more than 1,000 participants in 5 waves. We asked them to rate 30 resumes hosted in a Qualtrics survey. In total, more than 30,000 resumes were rated. And this survey was designed to take up to 30 minutes to complete. We ran this experiment from September 2019 to July 2020. And a key feature is that participants did not know they were part of an experiment until they completed the survey. And this is going to be important to ensure data quality. We tried to keep the task as similar to what small companies usually post in MTurk to get help in hiring processes. So going to the design details, the survey had 3 parts. First, we asked participants to rate their resumes. We asked them to rate the ability to fulfill a clerical position for 30 fictitious candidates using the same 7-point Likert scale we use in the lab experiments. Then we asked them an attention check question. And then we brought back the resumes to evaluate, ask them to evaluate if the candidate has the necessary skills for the position, how much supervision they need, and their communication skills. Then we asked them demographic information. We asked them a second attention check question, and we ended the survey with a couple of trust and altruism questions, although these questions were unincentivized in this case. We signal age and ethnicity using resume characteristics. We use high school graduation year to signal age, and we use the candidate's name on the resume to signal if the candidate is Hispanic. And we match the distribution of names to the proportion of Hispanics in Texas. So 80% of the resumes have a non-Hispanic first and last name, 10% have a Hispanic first and last name, 5% have a non-Hispanic first name and a Hispanic last name, and 5% have a Hispanic first name and a non-Hispanic last name. When one works in MTurk, one has to take care to ensure data quality, and we took several steps to ensure the best possible quality in the data. We applied several quality checks, and in total, 329 participants did not pass at least one of these checks and were excluded from the sample. So we only work with participants who pass all the checks. And to give you a sense of their characteristics, we can see here that it's a more educated sample than the average US population. Almost 63 participants have college or more education. 62% of them have some sort of hiring experience. 67% have some sort of managerial experience. And almost 86% of the sample has more than 6 years of working experience. One limitation here compared to the lab experiments is that we cannot track what participants are seeing in the resumes. So to check if we check if resume characteristics predict ratings as a way to make sure that participants are paying attention. So what we do here is we take all the resume characteristics, we create a dummy variable for each one of them, and use them to train 3 machine learning models and estimate a linear regression and check the predictive power of these machine learning models. And we can conclude that resume characteristics do have a good predictive power, suggesting that participants are reading the resumes before rating. And what's important is that job histories related to clerical experience, job histories with details and skill related to clerical will have high weight in these predictive models and also are very significant in the OLS regression, while resume characteristics not relevant for a clerical position have low weights or are insignificant in the OLS results. So moving to the results, here are resume ratings by ethnicity and age. And again, we don't find a significant difference between Hispanic and non-Hispanic resumes. We can see that Hispanics experience an increasing trend in ratings as they age, while there's a slight decrease in ratings for older non-Hispanics, starting at age 55 here, all the way down here. If we split the Hispanic signal by the different types of signal that we included in the resumes, again, we don't find a significant difference compared to non-Hispanic resumes. For candidates with a Hispanic first name and last name, the ratings are actually very close to the ones for non-Hispanics. And the increasing trend is present for the groups that only have a Hispanic first name or a Hispanic last name, but not both. Going to some estimation results, we don't find significant difference on average between Hispanics and non-Hispanics. The point estimates are very small compared to the baseline level. It's 0.6% and basically. And it's important to note that we have power to detect anything but small effect sizes here. The same is true if we split the Hispanic signal by the different types that we have. Again, we don't see any large differences here. Finally, we fitted a quadratic trend in age and interacted this trend with our Hispanic indicator. And we find that for non-Hispanics, ratings are following a linear pattern across age, while for Hispanics, ratings follow a U-shaped pattern across age, which is consistent with the first picture I showed you before. We can now split results by gender of the candidate. And again, we don't see significant differences between Hispanics and non-Hispanics. Ratings for men are very similar between Hispanics and non-Hispanics, and the increasing trend that we saw before is present basically for women.
Roberto, 3 more minutes.
Yes, thank you. We match the sample. We match the sample with the HR sample using observables, and then we can see very similar patterns between the two groups. And again, there are no significant differences in ratings. We also check heterogeneity by participant characteristics. We do several checks in this presentation due to time constraints. I'm going to focus only on 3: gender, ethnicity, and race of the participant. In terms of gender, there are no differences for men and women. Again, we don't find significant differences in ratings. For participants who identify as a Hispanic, they tend to give higher ratings overall here compared to the graph in the left. And the ratings are slightly higher for Hispanic resumes, although they're not statistically different from non-Hispanics. And finally, white participants tend to give lower ratings on average compared to the non-white participants. And again, we don't see a significant differences between Hispanic and non-Hispanic resumes. We also check regional heterogeneity by checking the region where the participant lives. And we can see that in the Southwest and the Midwest that have large Hispanic populations, Hispanics tend to have larger ratings, and we can see the increasing trend with age. Here it's important to note that the Southwest is defined as everything that was once upon a time a part of Mexico, so California is included in the Southwest. We also check heterogeneity between red and blue states, using the results from the 2016 election to classify states. And again, we don't see a significant difference. Patterns are very similar to the main results. And the upward trend is driven by participants living in blue states. Finally, we check the effects of Hispanic stereotypes. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go through the details here. But we check first the stereotype that Hispanics are lazy and need more supervisions. We ask participants to rate the need for supervision and find no significant difference between ethnicities. There's also the stereotype that Hispanics have poor communication skills. We ask participants to rate the communication skills of the candidate and find no significant difference between ethnicities. The patterns are very similar to the main results in ratings. There's also the stereotype that Hispanics have many children and require time off work. Here we find evidence that women may be affected by this stereotype. What we did is we signal having children by adding volunteering at a PTA or volunteering at a Catholic food bank in the resumes. And the signal suggests that women may be affected by this. And there's also the stereotype that Hispanics work in low-skilled jobs. And here we find evidence that having previous experience in low-skilled jobs affects Hispanics less than non-Hispanics. And having high-quality experience gives Hispanics a premium in ratings compared to non-Hispanics. So there's some evidence that this stereotype might be present. So to conclude, in using national survey data and 3 experiments, we don't find significant discernible patterns to labor market outcomes between Hispanics and non-Hispanics by cohort and age. There's also no difference when we check a resident cross-section. And when we go to the experiments, hypothetical Hispanics and non-Hispanics job applicants for a clerical position are treated similarly by age in the 3 experiments. The caveat here is that these results are not externally valid to other education levels, In particular, there's a large share of Hispanics that is getting more educated over time, and we cannot speak, so we need more research to understand what's going on with that group. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. So I will be stepping in for the discussion now. So let me share my screen. Okay, so here are my slides. These are visible?
Yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. All right, so the first thing I want to do, well, actually, let me reset the timer. All right, so first thing I want to do is just provide a brief summary of the empirical objectives as well as the results. So the first component was to compare labor market outcomes between Hispanic and non-Hispanic high school graduates in the US. This section was largely descriptive using surveys, US surveys that we use and are very familiar with. And the finding is that the differences between the two groups, if any, were relatively consistent across age compared to the Black-white differences across ages that were documented in a previous study by Joanna. All right, and then the second one I think is very interesting, which is evaluating specifically the demand side mechanisms for labor supply over the life course. And this is done via resume evaluations. So there were 3 particular experiments that were conducted with different evaluators. One was a group of students, another was human resources, and the third is using the MTurk from Amazon. And so as Roberto said, names were randomly assigned, both first and last names in the third experiment. And statistically, what they find is that there are no kind of systemic patterns of differential treatment across applicants with Hispanic names versus non-Hispanic last names. So my comments on the first one is that the only thing that comes to mind here, because these are largely looking at kind of equilibrium outcomes over the life course, is that even though labor supply outcomes may be very similar over the life course, the underlying mechanisms could still be very, very different. And so one thing that I would suggest is to think about things like changes in health, which I think Maria is going to talk about next, asset accumulation, social security wealth, as well as liquidity constraints. And what I have in mind here is that you might have one group that is working simply because liquidity constraints and another group working because they're not as non-constrained, and those have very different implications for welfare. The second paper, second component of the paper is a question about measurement error. And so if the question is, do evaluators treat applicants that are perceived to be minorities differently, and we're using a Hispanic name as an indicator for minority status, if there's not a direct link between Hispanics and perceived minority, then we could get measurement error. If we're defining the true treatment as perceived minority, we would get measurement error, which leads to obviously bias and statistical power issues. So some of the questions that I thought about as I was reading this paper is a Hispanic first or last name a strong predictor of an applicant's race, ethnicity, or underrepresented minority status, particularly from an evaluator's perspective? And second, in this literature is a big concern, is the correlation between the name and socioeconomic status. And is the name simply a proxy for, or being perceived as a measure of socioeconomic status? And if it is correlated, it's not clear if it's positive or negative as it is in other contexts. We could imagine some scenarios where the correlation between Hispanic names could be positively or negatively related to socioeconomic status. So one thing to keep in mind, and this is raised in this literature on names, is that the last name is largely exogenous, like you're kind of given the last name. And so the first name is being chosen conditional on whatever that last name is signaling. And so for Hispanics and Asians in particular, if they often have distinctively Hispanic or Asian last names, the signal is already there in the last name. And so people might be conditional on that, signaling something very different when it comes to the first name. So this last quote here comes from a paper by Fryer and Levitt in 2004, and they note that Black choices of first names today differ substantially more from whites than the names chosen by native-born Hispanics and Asians, meaning to say that Hispanics and Asians, native-born Hispanics and Asians are much more likely to have non-Asian or Hispanic names than Blacks. And so the point I'm making here is that the signal of the Hispanic name as it relates to minority status, as it relates to socioeconomic status, is not as directly clear, I think, in this context. So the authors actually, to their credit, addressed some of these questions, and I actually thought this table here, table 5 of the paper, was really fascinating, which is with the MTurk sample, they give a non-Hispanic name or Hispanic name, and they are asked, the evaluators, whether they perceive this person to be a minority. And so if the applicant has a non-Hispanic name, then, and this is excluding distinctively Black name applicants, so this is really just distinctively white names, most evaluators say that this is not a minority, 92.6%. Only 7.4% consider these people to be minority candidates. But then when we look at whether they perceive Hispanics to be minorities, it's a little kind of all over the map. So like as low as 43.7% of applicants that have Hispanic first names and non-Hispanic last names are considered to be a minority. And having any signal, meaning a first name or a last name being an Hispanic, it's only 58%. And so what this means is that the signal of Hispanic as it relates to minority, and this ties back to what I said at the beginning, which is if the treatment is, do I perceive this applicant to be a minority, and we're using Hispanic names as the right-hand side variable, then we could eventually, could be getting attenuation bias in a sense of how does a perceived minority indicator affect resume evaluations. So again, measurement consequences of this would be measurement error, which leads to attenuation bias. So the point estimates that you might be getting could be smaller than the true. And then also the attenuation bias will also affect your power calculation. So the authors do power calculations to say how big of a sample do we need to get statistically significant effects, but those assumed that there was no measurement error. And so if you actually include measurement error in that calculation, you might get a much larger sample than you originally calculated. And so both of these issues combined could lead to low power tests. So in some of the figures that you showed, there were differences, but they weren't statistically significant. And my only concern here is that maybe these are simply just low powered with these consequences. So one suggestion would be simply, and this is just the crude back of the envelope calculation, is to simply divide the estimates that you get on the first name, last name being Hispanic by the 1% perceived minority that was from the previous table. So this is essentially inflating your estimates, just kind of a back of the envelope calculation by 100%, like doubling the effects of the evaluation. Or the second one, which I've seen in papers for distinctively Black names, is to simply come up with some continuous measure for distinctiveness. I don't know how this would work with Hispanic names, but maybe there are some names that are more perceived to be a minority versus others. And so for each name that you present, you can estimate the probability that an evaluator would consider that person to be a minority. And once you have this p-hat, use that as the right-hand side variable to get kind of this dichotomous, like what is the causal effect of minority as opposed to what's the causal effect of having a Hispanic name. What would be interesting if you were to do this exercise, and you could do this, I think, in the MTurk sample, is again to what you did with the resume evaluations. It would be interesting also to include evaluator characteristics in a model such as the second bullet point. So is it the case that some people consider a Hispanic name to be associated with minority versus other types of evaluators? And yeah, so I think overall it's a very interesting paper. I think the second part of the paper it was pretty fascinating, and particularly, like I said, that table 5 was pretty illuminating for me. And so going forward, it would just be to kind of think a little bit more about the differences of naming between different populations, particularly if we're going to compare studies across one another, and then come up with some statistical solutions for how the signal to noise might impact our estimates as well as our interpretations. Okay. Stop sharing. All right, so the second, so if you showed up late, let me just remind everyone what we're going to do is if you have any questions for any of the presentations, write them in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of the screen. write the presenter's name as well as the question. We'll get to those at the very end. So the next presenter is Emma. Or no, Maria is presenting. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't know how to unmute myself. So my paper co-author with EGMA is called Healthy Aging Among Older Mexican Immigrants. And let me start. So the literature has found that Hispanics display a mortality advantage relative to non-Hispanic whites. And a natural question that arises seeing the mortality advantage is whether it extends to other health outcomes. So there's been a number of papers that have looked for evidence that Hispanics have a health advantage relative to non-Hispanic whites. And the evidence is a little bit more mixed. As Roberto mentioned before, there is not an advantage in some outcomes. For example, Hispanic immigrants are more likely to have a disability in old age, but it appears to be present for some other outcomes, for example, for hypertension. Whether we find evidence of health advantage or not in a sample depends on certain things. For example, it depends on the ethnicity and nativity of the people in our sample. The health advantage appears to be particularly strong for Mexican-born immigrants. The health advantage is stronger for recent immigrants to the United States and then seems to decline over time, and it may be stronger for men than for women. So what we tried to do in this paper is first look for evidence of a health advantage in a sample of older Mexican immigrants. So the vast majority of people in our sample will have been in the United States for at least 2 decades, and in some cases for 3 or 4 decades. So if part of the health advantage disappears with the assimilation process, we may be less likely to find it in this group of older people. We are going to test for differences in the health advantage between Mexican immigrant men and women. And an important focus of our paper is that we are going to investigate whether conclusions about this health advantage depend on whether we use self-reported or more objective measures of chronic conditions. So most existing papers have based their analysis on self-reported measures of diagnosis of chronic conditions. We are going to use those, but we're also going to be able to look at these more objective measures that I mentioned, and I will describe in detail in a little bit. The data are going to come from the Health and Retirement Study, which is a biennial panel survey of adults over the age of 50 and their spouses. And the only thing that I want to underline about the data is that for a subsample of the full HRS sample, biomarkers and anthropometric measurements are available that will allow us to construct our more objective indicators. So let me go to the health outcomes directly. We analyze more health outcomes in the paper, but in the presentation, I'm going to focus on those for which we have both the self-reported and the biomarker-based measure. So let me describe diabetes and hypertension together. So for both these outcomes, the self-reported measure, which is measure number 1, is based on a question where the HRS respondent is asked, have you ever been told by a doctor that you have diabetes or high blood sugar? And in the case of hypertension, have you ever been told by a doctor that you have high blood pressure or hypertension? For diabetes, the more objective measure is based on the results of a blood test that is performed on HRS respondents, where we can measure the level of hemoglobin A1C. And we are going to set up a threshold of 6.5% and describe or code individuals with more than 6.5% as having diabetes. For hypertension, we have 3 blood pressure readings that are taken 45 seconds apart. And we are going to check whether the average systolic reading is 140 or above, or the average diastolic reading is 90 or above. So I want to underline already, or to highlight from the beginning, that for both diabetes and hypertension, the 2 measures, the self-reported and the biomarker-based ones, are not directly comparable. And the reason for that is that the self-reports are trying to capture diagnosis, whereas the more objective measures are just capturing whether the individual has uncontrolled diabetes or hypertension. So it would be possible that an individual is diagnosed with diabetes or hypertension, and then they are prescribed some behavioral modifications or some medication that allows them to control the condition, and therefore we would not observe higher blood sugar levels or high blood pressure. We think that it is arguably more interesting to focus on these uncontrolled versions of the conditions rather than diagnoses themselves, because uncontrolled diabetes and uncontrolled hypertension are associated with the most serious health consequences. But in any case, what matters from our point of view is that both of these objective measures are not going to be affected in any way by potential underdiagnosis. The blood test and the blood pressure readings are going to be available for every single person in our subsample. And then I'll also present information on obesity. So an individual is going to be coded as being obese if their body mass index is above 30. The self-reported measure of obesity is going to be computed using self-reports of height and weight provided by the respondent. The more objective measure is going to be or the BMI used to compute the more objective measure is going to be constructed using height and weight measurements taken by the interviewer. So let me, for the descriptive statistics, just focus on the subsample with biomarkers, which is the subsample for which we've got information on both self-reported and biomarker-based outcomes. So I don't have time to talk about the differences in demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, but I just want to mention that they are very different between the samples of Mexican immigrants and the samples of non-Hispanic whites. And they are different in a way that replicates previous findings in the literature. All results that I'm going to be showing you today control for demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. So let me focus on the health outcomes, self-reported on the middle panel and biomarker based on the lower panel. So for diabetes, we find that the prevalence of the condition is lower when we look at the biomarker-based health outcome for non-Hispanic white men, for Mexican immigrant women, and for non-Hispanic white women. However, for Mexican immigrant men, the prevalence of diabetes appears to be, or it's more or less the same, whether we look at the self-reported outcome or the biomarker-based outcome. And this could be due to different reasons. So one possibility would be that Mexican immigrant men are less likely to be able to control the condition. Maybe, for example, they could have less access to treatment. But we suspect that part of what is going on is that Mexican immigrant men are less likely to be diagnosed with the condition. And part of the reason why that appears to be the case is that if you look at the gap between Mexican immigrant men and non-Hispanic whites, in terms of self-reported diagnosis, is much smaller than the gap between Mexican immigrant women and non-Hispanic white women. So we think that Mexican immigrant men are likely underreporting diabetes diagnosis, maybe because they are not aware, or they are less likely to be aware that they have the condition. For hypertension, the prevalence is once more lower when we focus on the biomarker-based outcome relative to the self-reported outcome. This is true for the 4 groups that we consider, but once more, the gap is the smallest when we focus on Mexican immigrant men. And again, we suspect that this is evidence of some degree of underdiagnosis for Mexican immigrant men. And finally, for obesity, the prevalence in this case is actually higher when we look at the biomarker-based outcome. The reason for that is that in every single one of the 4 groups that we consider, people appear, or respondents are underreporting their weight when we look at the self-reported measure. And interestingly, and I don't have a good story for why this is the case, but Mexican immigrant men are actually much less likely to underreport their weight, than the other 3 groups that we consider. All right, so for the results, let me first show you odds ratios for Mexican immigrants relative to non-Hispanic whites for each one of the three outcomes that I'm focusing on in the full sample. So what we find here replicates previous findings in the literature. We find that Mexican immigrant men are at a similar or lower risk or lower odds of reporting all these three conditions. So the odds ratios are not significantly different from 1 for diabetes and obesity, but men are at 40%, or Mexican immigrant men are at 40% lower odds of reporting hypertension. In the case of women, there is no unambiguous health advantage because Mexican immigrant women are at an 80% or have 80% higher odds of self-reporting diabetes. And these p-values are for the test of equality of the odds ratios across genders. And we find that in every single case, the odds ratio is lower for men than it is for women, suggesting that men, this is the third bullet point here, that older Mexican immigrant men have a more favorable health profile than women. So we think that there are three main possible explanations for this health difference between Mexican immigrant men and women at older ages. One possibility is that Mexican immigrant men are more positively selected than women upon arrival in the United States. So they've got a better fixed effect, and we are able to detect that better fixed effect when we find them in our sample 2 or 3 decades down the road. Another possibility is that Mexican immigrant men and women have similar health profiles upon arrival in the United States, but women's health outcomes converge faster to those of non-Hispanic whites. And there is some evidence in the literature looking at immigrants, Hispanic immigrants in particular, in the first decade or decade and a half after arrival that suggests that indeed the convergence is faster for women than it is for men. And there could be a mixture of explanations 1 or 2. The important thing is that both explanations 1 and 2 would imply that there are real health disparities between older Mexican immigrant men and older Mexican immigrant women. An alternative possibility is that the difference that we are seeing is just a data artifact that could arise because there is a lot of evidence in the literature that men in general, but in particular immigrant men, are much less likely than women to interact with healthcare services. And that may imply, as I suggested before, that Mexican immigrant men are less likely to be diagnosed with chronic health conditions. And as a result, they would be self-reporting this diagnosis less often than Mexican immigrant women. So we are working on analyzing the three hypotheses, but today I'm going to focus just on the third one, on trying to understand the extent to which these underdiagnoses are driving the differences that we find between older Mexican immigrant men and women. So to do that, I'm going to show you odds ratios for Mexican immigrants relative to non-Hispanic whites. And now I'm going to compare the odds ratios coming from specifications with self-reported measures to those with biomarker measures. So and this analysis is performed just on the subsample for which I've got access to both measures. So this subsample is about 1/4 of the full sample for which I was showing results before. So for diabetes, when we focus on the self-reported measure, we find that the odds ratio is much larger and statistically significant for women only. However, when we look at the biomarker-based measure, both odds ratios increase, those for men and for women, but they increase comparatively more for men. And this is consistent with this explanation that I mentioned, this possibility that I mentioned that Mexican immigrant men may be more likely to be underdiagnosed with diabetes. As a result of this larger increase in the odds ratio for men than for women, now we find that the p-value of the difference in odds ratios is no longer significant. So there's no evidence of men being relatively better off, older Mexican immigrant men being relatively better off than older Mexican immigrant women when we compare them with their non-Hispanic white counterparts. For hypertension, with the self-reported measure, we found an advantage for both Mexican immigrant men and women, which was only significant for men. When we look at the biomarker, there's still an advantage for both Mexican immigrant groups, but in this case, it is only significant for women. And we think that the fact that the odds ratio actually worsens for men or increases for men is again consistent with the higher rate of underdiagnosis. And once more, in this case, when we use the biomarker-based measure, we find no statistical difference between men and women. And then finally, for obesity, there's very little difference between the two measures. Remember that in this case, the self-reported measure of obesity did not rely on a diagnosis. So we were not expecting in this case to find an effect related to underdiagnosis as we did with the previous two indicators. So again, for obesity, very little change depending on whether we look at the self-reported or the biomarker-based measure, and once more, no statistical difference between men and women. So to summarize,
just 4 minutes.
Okay,
Oh,
I'm almost done. Thank you. So we find evidence of a health advantage when we look at the biomarkers for some conditions, but not for others. So for example, there's a clear disadvantage for older Mexican immigrants in terms of diabetes or uncontrolled diabetes, which is what we're measuring here. So the odds of having the condition according to the biomarker are 105% higher for men and 119% higher for women compared to their non-Hispanic counterparts. We do find that older Mexican immigrants of both genders have an advantage in uncontrolled hypertension, which we think is remarkable because we are able to find this advantage, even though, as I say, we're looking at a sample of immigrants that have been in the United States for a long time. And then we find that older Mexican immigrants have no advantage whatsoever in obesity. Now, most important for our purposes, we find no significant differences across genders in the biomarker-based measures, which would support the hypothesis that Mexican immigrant men are relatively more likely to be underdiagnosed. So to conclude, our results underscore the importance of combining self-reported data on health diagnosis with more objective indicators of chronic conditions in order to draw conclusions about health disparities for older Mexican immigrants. And we think that this is a conclusion that very likely extends to other immigrant communities. So the issue of underdiagnosis, particularly in the population of men, is unlikely to be just confined to the older Mexican immigrant population. We also think that further attention should be given to the rates and determinants of underdiagnosis of chronic conditions in older immigrant populations. So we think that this is important for two reasons. From a more theoretical perspective, we think that understanding the rates of underdiagnosis would allow us to reinterpret previous results obtained in the literature regarding the health advantage of Hispanic migrants, which have been obtained in the vast majority of cases using self-reported measures. And also from a public policy perspective, this issue of underdiagnosis should be one of the levers that we may want to be focusing on. So before thinking about how do we increase, for example, access to treatments for older immigrant populations, we have to be able to determine what share of these populations is actually suffering from the conditions. And yeah, I wrote here some questions for further research because we are working on studying the importance of the other two explanations, so differences across genders in the degree of health selection at the time of arrival in the United States and potential differences in assimilation rates. But I wanted to point out that if present, all these two or both these two explanations are going to favor women relative to men. So the fact that just accounting for or just looking at the biomarker-based measures, we find no statistical differences between men and women, suggests that if on top of that women were to actually be, as we would expect, less positively selected than men or have more unfavorable assimilation processes, all of this would suggest that overall would give us even less reason to think that men are having an actual health advantage with respect to women. Okay, and that's it for me.
Clear.
Hi, I'm very glad to have this opportunity to have gotten to know this paper and to give some comments. So thanks very much. I'm going to give some comments first, just overview the paper. Again, I think Maria did a really great job explaining all the questions and the findings. I'm going to just briefly summarize what I think are the big pictures here. And it's just to see whether the Hispanic paradox, which is well documented in many general forms, how it is at older ages and differential by gender. And there's a strong form and a weak form in the paper. Maria and Emily go into this a little bit more, how the strong form of the paradox is that even without any controls for SES, there are outcomes on which Hispanic health results are better, and that's surprising because of the lower SES in many regards. But then a weak form of this paradox is that when sometimes these advantages appear only when controlling for SES. So the reason why older ages are particularly interesting to look at is because there are many reasons why what we might find in younger ages may not be reflected in differentials in older ages. For example, especially when it comes to Black-white differences in health, this shows up often, is that there's lots of selective mortality differentials that make the outcomes look different at younger ages than older ages. I think that looking at self-reported and objective health measures, as was really well explained, is such a great contribution and very important for this literature. And that's because whenever we're studying differences in health, in the healthcare access and health literature, it's just such a big problem that we don't know whether the differences we see are due to differential access and therefore knowledge of a condition and treatment and recognition of it versus actually underlying health differences. And so having biomarker and anthropomorphic data in addition to self-reported data really help us get at unmet healthcare needs in a way that's different from some typical surveys just outright ask, do you have an unmet need? And that might not show up really even in this way. So just as an additional motivation slide, I'm going to next show data as of through last week on COVID-19 mortality differences, because this is, again, another really important motivation for looking at this. I'm going to talk about now the differences in the importance of age here. So first I'll show what race disparities are like in death rates with age adjustment and what it looks like without the age adjustment. So on where it says age standardized, that's with age adjustments occurring, and all ages without adjustment is the other set. And you'll see especially for Hispanic populations, age adjustment makes a very big difference. And in fact, if you look into the microdata, it's ages 35 to 44 where the differentials are the greatest. So this paper, using health and retirement study data, look at what evidence there is for gender and race and ethnicity differences in self-reported measures first, and then ask, is the difference we see between men and women really coming due to healthcare seeking behavior, by then going to biomarker data and finding therefore that there isn't as much of a difference between men and women. The conclusion that what jumps out is that there is greater underdiagnoses therefore among men. And the findings, I think the table I like the best that gave a really great takeaway is the one that Maria just presented, which shows for men and women, for each type of health condition of the three that have both self-reported and biomarker, what the differences are relative to non-Hispanic whites. And you can see here that there's just such a rich story that can be told that Maria did a really good job saying this is the starting point for many other questions, because this just suggests lots of stories that have not yet been tested. So I'm going to just suggest a few additional analyses that might get at some of these mechanisms. Partly, I'm going to think about things that can be done with the same data, same method, just use some more measures perhaps. So first is that thinking about what the HRS is really good at, there are some great wealth measures there that one could separate SES into typical SES measures available in other data sets, and then what do we get when we add wealth? So by that, what I mean is taking on and there's more in this, more in the paper on this and in the presentation, the strong versus the weak form of the Hispanic paradox, and testing out just how important the wealth measures are, because there are huge differences in these wealth measures across race and ethnicity, especially in the older age ranges. And the other is to just start maybe, and this is probably, I know this is an early stage paper, or something you've thought about doing in the future, is just to do some more decompositions to see what explains these male-female gaps. So again, with the same data, another question that might be interesting, especially given the underdiagnoses for men, is just to see whether marriage is seem to be protective. And then to go in to these next questions of what can we do with policy, just to see whether this gap then becomes this alternative measure of unmet needs that can be looked at as the right-hand side variable, as the left-hand side variable, when looking at what insurance expansions do to health outcomes. So other things that can be done, and this goes into additional data, is to think about early versus late diagnoses of cancer. And this is data that's available for everybody through SEER, so you don't have to be as worried as with other data sets with smaller sample sizes, because, well, by being able to see whether men versus women, all the same four differences, just seeing whether there is more late stage diagnoses of cancer for Hispanic men might be correlated, might be another outcome to look at. And then my last point is just to push on doing more with the younger ages, particularly for understanding these big differences in the COVID death rates, is to think about using the same methods you're using. And perhaps the NHANES data set is one that has, because it has biomarker and anthropomorphic data and has the self-reported data as well, perhaps you can see whether there are bigger or smaller gaps in underreported conditions like diabetes, which are particularly relevant for the mortality outcomes in COVID, and push this research agenda forward. But I really, really think there are some great contributions here, and thank you again.
Excellent. So we'll move on to the next presentation.
All right, can you see my slides?
Yep, you're all good.
Great. So there's been substantial interest in both academically and among policymakers in the long-term decline in employment of lesser educated men in general and Black men in particular. And what figure 1 here shows the non-Hispanic Black-white difference in employment rate for men with a high school degree or less by single year of age across calendar years. So if you look at the vertical axis, this is the percentage point difference between Black and white men in their employment rate, and the horizontal axis is age. And what you can see here is if you look across time, so we have 1980. These data, by the way, are from the 1980 through 2010 decennial censuses and the 2016 ACS. what you can see is there's been a pronounced erosion of Black employment relative to white employment for lesser educated men. So this is widely recognized. What's less appreciated is the age pattern of the change. If you look from 1980 to 1990, a lot of the erosion of the employment standing of Black men was among younger Black men, just under the age of 40. In contrast, after 1990, much of the erosion of employment of lesser educated Black men was among older Black men relative to white men, that is 45 and older. And so this coincides, this erosion of Black employment for lesser educated men coincides with, among other things, the rise in national mass incarceration. So figure 2 shows the male incarceration rate in state and federal prisons by race over this period from 1980 to 2016. The incarceration rate rose rapidly from 1980 to a peak in year 2000, especially for Black men, and then has declined slowly since. This has resulted in an aging of the US prison population and the population of ex-prisoners. So this is kind of illustrated rather dramatically in figure 3, which shows the age distribution of male federal and state prisoners by race for selected years taken from the Bureau of Justice Statistics census of prisoners. And you can see there's been a dramatic decline in the share of men in prison between the ages of 18 and 34 of both races, and a dramatic increase of older prisoners age 45 and older for both races. So what we're asking in this paper is, to what extent are these two phenomena linked? You have a large relative decline in the employment rate of older, lesser educated Black men, and at the same time you have kind of this aging of the prison population, the population of ex-prisoners. And to what extent are these two things linked? And we outline really what we think are four necessary conditions for this to occur. The first is that incarceration must reduce subsequent employment, and there is now a long literature that of studies that have been relatively narrowly focused but tightly identified that have explored various links between incarceration and subsequent employment using various identification strategies. I think the general takeaway from this literature is that there is quite substantive evidence that incarceration affects subsequent employment opportunities and earnings. The second necessary condition is that the timing of the rise in mass incarceration has to align with this decline, this age-related decline in employment for lesser educated men. And so if you look at 45 to 61-year-olds in 2016, how old were these individuals at the beginning of this time frame? So they were 9 to 25 years old in 1980 and 19 to 35 years old in 1990. So these are individuals, these now older individuals in 2016 were teenagers and young men at the advent of the crack epidemic and the introduction of stricter sentencing policies in the 1990s. So the timing actually links up nicely in the sense that this is a cohort of lesser educated men that really did get exposed to these changes in the market for crime and punishment. Third, you need to have a measure of lifetime exposure to incarceration. So what's important here is that we're not looking at those individuals who are currently incarcerated. We want to look at individuals who have been touched by incarceration. That is, individuals who are currently incarcerated, as well as those who are formerly incarcerated. And measuring the former is relatively straightforward, but measuring the latter, that is, who or the share of the population that's formerly incarcerated, is actually challenging, and that's one contribution here that we do in this paper. And then finally, you have to have differences in the exposure to incarceration over the life course that are large enough to have detectable effects on employment. Now, anyone who has kind of monitored the Black experience in America knows that these differences in incarceration between Black and white men are profound. But for those of you who aren't aware of this, we'll show you that these indeed are very large. Okay, so we're going to draw on data in the empirical analysis on older, lesser educated men, which for the purposes of this study are defined to be men who are 45 to 61 years old with a high school degree or less. We stop at age 61 to avoid issues with retirement and claiming of Social Security benefits at age 62. And that's what our definition is going to be. And we're going to draw data on men from the 34 largest states from the 1980 through 2010 decennial censuses, supplemented by the 2006 through 2016 ACSs. These data sources are important because they sample both the non-institutionalized population and the institutionalized population. And we're going to use these data to form a state-by-year panel on Black-white employment differences for these older, lesser educated men. The focal outcome here is going to be the Black-white difference in the employment rate for older men, older, lesser educated men in state S in year T. Let me illustrate what this looks like. Figure 4 shows the Black-white difference in the employment rate for older, lesser educated men by year and by selected state. So if you look on the vertical axis shows you the percentage point difference between Black and white older men with a high school degree or less in their employment. So a negative number here means that black men are faring worse than white men. On the horizontal axis, you see the calendar year. So if we can start with the dashed line, which is the fitted regression line from a simple regression of the Black-white difference in employment on a linear calendar year time trend. And you can see that the time trend here is downward sloping. Over time, Black men have fared worse than white men in terms of employment opportunity, in terms of employment. But you also see, I've plotted here just for a selection of 8 of the 34 states in our analysis sample, what the state level variation is across time. And what's really interesting here is if you start in 1980, the Black-white differences in employment rate for older, lesser educated men were clustered pretty tightly together across states. That clustering has unraveled. There's greater variance in Black-white differences in employment rates over time to where you get to 2015, 2016, there's really a large spread across states in terms of Black-white employment differences for older men. And if you want to have a really stark example, you can look at the solid round dots, which are Wisconsin. You can see by 2015, 2016, that older Black men have about a 35 percentage point a lower employment rate than comparable lesser educated white men. And so what this shows you is that there's both time series variation and state by time variation in the Black-white employment rate. Now, our focal explanatory variable is going to be what we call incarceration exposure, and it's defined as the share of older, lesser educated men who were ever incarcerated by race, state, and year. And we're going to denote exposure as X. And we're going to measure whether you're ever incarcerated as the sum of those who are currently incarcerated at the time of the survey, plus an estimate of those who were formerly incarcerated at the time of the survey. Now, the former here is pretty straightforward to calculate. So you can calculate the currently incarcerated directly in the census and ACS using their information on institutionalization and residence in group quarters. What's more challenging is calculating the share of race by state and year that are formerly incarcerated, because there are not very good data sources on this for the standard data sources that economists use. So what we're going to do is we're going to leverage work that was initially done by Thomas Bonzar, who is at the Bureau of Justice Statistics. What he did is he used a demographic life table approach to calculate the share of formerly incarcerated men by race, state, and year using a life table approach. So the idea is he uses by race, state, and year flows into state, local, and federal prisons with release data, with recidivism data, and mortality data to basically measure the lifetime exposure by race, state, and year for all men. And he did this up through year 2000. Sarah Shannon and her colleagues in an article in Demography in 2017 improved upon this methodology and extended it up through 2010. And Mike and I extend this through 2016. And these estimates are for all men by race, state, and year. We want just older, lesser educated men. So we adjust these measures for the age and education composition of prisoners using other BJS data sources to form our measure for the target group of older, lesser educated men. And then we take the black-white difference between these two, and that's going to be our explanatory variable. And it's depicted here in Figure 5. Figure 5 shows the black-white difference in what we call lifetime incarceration exposure for older, lesser educated men by year and for selected states. So again, on the vertical axis, this is the percentage point difference between older, lesser educated Black and white men in the share ever incarcerated. So a positive number here means that the higher incarceration exposure for Blacks relative to whites. And on the horizontal axis, you have calendar years. So again, the dashed line is the fitted regression line between a simple regression of the black-white difference in incarceration exposure on a linear calendar year time trend. You can see there's an upward sloping time trend. And then again, I also depict the state by year variation by showing you for 8 selected states what that variation looks like. Again, for 1980, the black-white difference in incarceration exposure was tightly clustered and relatively small between Blacks and whites. It rises over time and fans out again to where there's substantial variation by 2015, 2016. Again, if you want a stark example of the differences in lifetime exposure to incarceration, you can look at the round dots here, which are Wisconsin, and you can see that by 2015, 2016, older black men with a high school degree or less in Wisconsin have about a 30 percentage point higher share or likelihood of having been incarcerated at some point in their life. Okay, so that's going to be our focal explanatory variable. And so now we want to relate the black-white difference in employment later in life with the black-white difference in lifetime incarceration exposure for these older Black men. So we really want to compare this Figure 5 with the previous figure, Figure 4. And so if we toggle between the two, what we can see is the following: is that there's an upward trend in incarceration exposure and a downward trend in the employment rate for these men, and there's a fanning out of the state variation over time in incarceration exposure and a fanning out of the state variation in the employment rate over time. So if we simply do the eyeball test here for these two figures, it looks the time series and the state by time variation that's depicted in these two figures looks pretty promising that there's a strong inverse relationship between incarceration exposure and later life employment for these men. But of course, we're going to want to rule out some other explanations. There are other factors that are going on in this time period, so we're going to move into a regression framework. So here's the basic regression framework. The dependent variable is going to be the black-white difference in employment of older men, older lesser educated men in state S and year T, and we're going to model that as a linear function of the black-white difference in lifetime incarceration exposure for older lesser educated men in state S and year T, as well as a function of a full set of state effects, a full set of calendar year effects, and a modest vector of Z of state by time varying controls, plus an error term. And so our goal is going to be to estimate beta in this panel and test the null hypothesis that beta is 0 versus the alternative that beta is less than 0, that basically incarceration, lifetime incarceration affects later life employment outcomes in this long time series. Our standard errors are going to be clustered at the state level, and our identifying assumption here in this panel regression is going to be that that conditional on the state time and the modest set of state by time effects, there's no correlation between the black-white differences in incarceration exposure and anything kicking around in the error term. So
you got about 2 more minutes.
Yep, that's great. Just a quick summary of the estimation results. Our focal estimate of beta here is -0.25 with a standard error of 0.08. So we can reject the null hypothesis that beta is equal to 0 in favor of the alternative at conventional levels of significance. Economically speaking, what does this mean? Well, it says that a 1 percentage point increase in the black-white difference in lifetime incarceration exposure is associated with a 1/4 of a percentage point increase in the black-white employment gap. So what does that translate to in terms of the time series? Well, if you map this into the time series changes that we started with in the first figure, our estimates imply the following: that the change in black-white incarceration exposure from the beginning of the sample period, 1980, to the end of the sample period, 2016, can explain about half of the change in the black-white employment gap when these men are older over the same time period. And so it suggests that there's that lifetime incarceration exposure is a substantive explanator for employment at older ages. These results are robust to inclusion of this, again, this modest set of state by time varying effects: state unemployment rate, the real value of the effective minimum wage, and a state trend in black-white employment gap of younger, lesser educated men. So what we've done, just to summarize, is we've uncovered a strong inverse correlation between the incarceration exposure and later life employment, but we temper those that we think has a substantive role in explaining the time series of what's happened to the employment of older black men relative to white men. But we temper these conclusions with the following caveats. First and foremost is incarceration exposure was not randomly assigned across state, time, and race for older, lesser educated men. Now, our identifying assumption is that this increase in incarceration exposure, conditional on state, time, and state by time control variables in our specifications, was plausibly exogenous. There is a literature and kind of a largely widely held view that a substantial portion of the increase in incarceration rates for black relative to white men was driven by changes in sentencing policies, such as truth in sentencing, 3 strikes, changes in parole policies, and early release for good behavior. But we have not tethered our identification into anything that would look like an instrumental variable type of identification framework. That, of course, opens the door for alternative explanations, which would render these correlations to be non-causal. The obvious candidates are that there's simply reverse causality from employment prospects to recidivism back, that then leads to greater incarceration exposure, or other cohort by race differences that are trending over time, such as different cohort by race differences in drug use that happen to be correlated with later life employability and incarceration exposure. We cannot rule those out in the preliminary analysis that we present today, but one important direction for future research is to kind of anchor the estimation in a causal framework that still preserves our ability to make some statements about the long time series, long run behavior. That's it. Thanks.
Great. So I will, so Perry, do I share my screen and do? It's my turn.
Yeah, you can share.
Great. Okay, so welcome everybody to Chicago for the ASSA meetings. Yeah, I enjoyed reading the paper, and thanks for having me on the panel. So I'm just gonna share a couple brief comments. First, I'll start with some of the key strengths of the paper so far. First, of course, is a hugely important topic, both mass incarceration on its own and also its interaction with the labor market. And I've just cited a couple cases. There are many more where there are key studies that look at inequality in earnings or intergenerational mobility. And the key thing that comes up in those studies, keeps coming up, is the role of incarceration and how it interacts with race. So there have been those other studies that have looked at this relationship with the labor market and then in this study, what we're seeing is this additional layer of demographic change and differences across different age groups and over time. This also has some important implications for retirement and Social Security. So I'm interested in knowing more about how that might play out. So for example, when people are incarcerated and then when they are out, if they're lacking employment opportunities, that can factor into like what kind of earnings you accrue towards your Social Security benefits, possibly eligibility for Social Security, and of course retirement as well, retirement savings and things like that. Another key contribution that was mentioned is that the authors extend some prior data on incarceration histories to a longer period of time, which is useful for their study, but in general updates some prior work that was done to estimate these histories. I think that there's, in the discussion, in the presentation, there's some discussion of this, but I always find it useful to think about what mechanisms could be at play or preferred mechanisms that the authors think might be most important for these dynamics. So there's some discussion of why there are different trends in the demographics of the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. And so one is like the general pattern that was shown, incarceration over time, like increasing and then decreasing. Another question that, I'm not an expert in this area, but does it matter what the policies are at a specific age? So, we're basically tracking differences in cohorts over time. So question about, one question I have is, if you're young or if you're like a teenager or young adult at a certain time, is that when, you're most at risk for these policies to be affecting what's going on, or does it matter throughout your entire life cycle, or how does that vary over the life cycle? And in addition, how does the relationship work? So do we care? How much do these different factors matter? For one, how long you've been in prison. So is it just that you've ever been in prison, incarcerated, or does the intensity, and also when you've been in prison, does that matter? And then there are two things that are combined here. There's like the having ever been incarcerated and also the current incarceration rate. And I think the outcomes are for those who are currently not incarcerated. So another question is, what do we think the relationship is between the current incarceration rate and the employment outcomes for the non-incarcerated? Should the history, I can see how the history can feed into my current employment opportunities, but the outcome variable is kind of measured among people who are not in an institution, I believe. So, does the current incarceration rate, the sign of that may even be ambiguous, because if I'm not incarcerated and a lot of people are, maybe, there are less people I'm competing against for jobs or something like that. And so that matters for the type of specification that you might want to use when you're trying to empirically test the links between these things. And so my other set of comments have to do with some thoughts on econometrics. And I actually don't have answers everywhere. So I understand that these are, challenges that, I don't necessarily have an answer for. So sometimes I'm just posing questions that I don't even know the answer to. So one thing is that the explanatory variable is likely to be serially correlated. So we're looking at the stock of having ever been incarcerated, and if people are fixed in the state where they live for the entire period, or for the entire period of observation, then that is kind of increasing until people either move out of the state or die. So it's something that's like accumulating over time, and so past values of this are going to be highly correlated with the current measure. So that's going to matter for, if nothing else, that matters for your inference, because you have correlation between these observations over time. Now, this is already brought up in the presentation that there could be secular trends in outcomes or observable. So a state where the difference in employment is trending up or trending down, or however you want to assign it, and how the difference in incarceration is trending, there could be, you know, unobservable things in a given state that lead to both of those gaps widening over time, like general sources of racism in a state, for example. And then, of course, this was also already mentioned, that there could be reverse causality. So the current gap in employment could feed into the current incarceration rate gap. So if the current economy is like weaker, or, you know, there's a recession in that geographic area, that could also increase the current incarceration rate, which is used as an explanatory variable for the outcome variable. And then there are also dynamic considerations. So your present incarceration history is a function of prior regimes. So that means the explanatory variables for other outcomes. So outcomes in the 90s, the explanatory variable there is the difference in, so if there's a particularly lenient or stringent like regime in one period, that's going to affect the explanatory variable in later periods. And that may be a restatement of what I said earlier, but also prior employment opportunities could affect current incarceration patterns. And then when we're comparing older people across time, so if you know, people in the 80s who were 45 and older are subject to particularly harsh criminal justice regimes, the people who are 45, like 20 years later, they were young people exposed to those harsh regimes. So there's, you know, it's harder to distinguish between those who are treated and untreated, because the old people in a later period were young people are exposed to those similar laws, while the comparison group of older people in the past are being observed or analyzed. And then the main specification looks at the difference in employment rates and the difference in incarceration rates. And that you can, you know, that can be recast as a more flexible or more general specification. So basically, I should have wrote this down, but by using the difference in having ever been incarcerated, that's the same thing as saying that the coefficient on the white having ever been incarcerated share in the black having ever been incarcerated share is the same but opposite signs. So you can just relax that and just use those separately as regressors. And also the outcome variable is a difference between two variables. So that's kind of like imposing that the coefficient on one variable is -1, like you can move that also to the other side. So you could just have black employment as an outcome variable and all the other three variables as control variables. And then the last thing I would say is that some real quick minor comments. For figure 1, I think that you could, there's an alternative way to maybe try to show this figure. So you could use changes in these differences by decade. So basically what we're supposed to look at in the picture is that going across lines from older to more recent periods, or so going from 1980 to 1990, there's a drop for younger ages, and then there's a drop for older ages looking at 1990 and forward. It's a little hard to figure that out. So you could just put the change over a decade for young people, the change over a decade for older people. And what we should see is that the change, there's a big change for younger people in the earlier decades, and then there's smaller changes for younger people in the later decades, and vice versa for older ages. I don't know if that makes sense, but offline, I could try to explain it more clearly. Or we could look at things by cohort as well, because you might see that the effect is moving is with a cohort and not as much driven by time variation. For figures 4 and 5, there we're just plotting a subset of the states. And so one way to try to get at this a little more is to separate the states and average them. So above and below median growth in an incarceration gap. And so, or you could choose the most extreme states, the top growing states, and the states, if there are any states trending in the opposite direction, you would expect that the outcome variable, the gap in employment, would have a gap in between those same two groups. So you can basically kind of construct, it's not like a difference in difference, but basically two separate groups with very different trends, you might think that they have different trends in the outcome variables. Two quick other minor questions is how were the states selected? So there's only 34 states. So what was that a data limitation or a choice by the researchers? And then the outcome variable is employment rate, but is that the employment to population ratio, or is that actually like employment to labor force, people in the labor force? Oh, let me stop sharing. Yeah, sorry. But yeah, I enjoyed reading the paper, and like I said, I think it's a very important topic.
All right, thank you very much. And so I will go last. Let me share my screen. All right, so the topic of the paper is estimating the effects of Social Security benefits on food insecurity, particularly at the early entitlement age. I want to thank support from the FNS at the USDA, as well as the University of Kentucky Center for Poverty Research. So the question is motivated by the impending fiscal insolvency of the Social Security Trust Fund and a lot of policy proposals to increase both the early entitlement age as well as the full retirement age. And so 62 is the early entitlement age, and you are eligible for reduced benefits there. If you want full benefits, you have to wait till age 65 to 67. And so a lot of the policy proposals and simulations with respect to the EEA want to raise the EEA from 62 to 63 or 64. This is a typo here. And so from an optimal EEA perspective, there are two things that we need to balance. One is the fiscal benefits, right? So you're going to spend less on benefits as well as gain revenues through additional work. And that has to be countered against the welfare losses that you would have if people were no longer eligible at age 62. And so the focus of this paper primarily is on the second bit, which is the welfare gains. All right, so to explore some of these issues, what I'm going to do is examine outcomes, particularly as people transition before and after the EEA. And so what that means is that people are going from ineligible to eligible for retired worker benefits. And I'm going to look at particularly changes in benefit receipt, labor supply, and measures of food insecurity. And today I'm just going to focus on the food insecurity. And the welfare question is, does food insecurity decrease at the EEA as individuals transition from being ineligible to eligible for retirement benefits? All right, just some motivation. I want to couch the paper in the optimal unemployment literature, which looks at the effects of particularly UI benefits on consumption. And so when it comes to the moral hazard effects versus liquidity effects, we're basically looking at the employment or duration of unemployment with respect to UI benefits. In terms of the welfare impacts of UI, this studies looked at consumption expenditures. And so here's a list of studies here. And this comes predominantly from two influential studies on optimal UI, which essentially show that the optimal level of benefits is a function of changes in consumption between employed to unemployed states. Now, one issue in this literature that has been noted is that by looking at consumption, it has led generally to pretty imprecise estimates, particularly because consumption expenditures is difficult to measure, as well as the sample sizes for which consumption is measured tend to be rather small. It also, the theory is not applicable to extreme levels of poverty, which I guess the theoretical conclusions come from assumptions about the utility function, and that may not apply when we're talking about subsistence level consumption. So the focus on food insecurity, I think, is the advantage here is it's going to be able to capture levels of consumption that would not be otherwise captured by average expenditures. Also, the change in food insecurity at the EA is not confounded by other expenditures that might be changing as people transition from working to not working. And so if people are decreasing their work-related expenditures at the same time, that could confound our interpretations of welfare. And then finally, food expenditures are not subject to what is referred to as consumption commitments in the same way as other types of expenditures like housing. And there have been studies to show that food appears to be the most sensitive relative to housing to changes in contemporaneous income. So it seems like food is on the margin, what people are foregoing to kind of smooth adverse shocks. So what I'm going to do is, again, look at the changes in food insecurity. And I'm also going to look particularly before the Great Recession and during and after the Great Recession. And the reason why is because older workers in particular faced job losses, though they were less severe for older workers. They also lost a lot of assets in both the real estate and the financial markets. And they faced decreased liquidity in the housing market. And for a number of these combination of factors would lead to the effects of Social Security benefits being greater for food security during and after the Great Recession than before. All right, so this figure basically is illustrating the changes in levels of food insecurity by year among older workers, 50 to 59 years old. And I have 3 measures that are in the CPS for food security, which is food insecure with no hunger, food insecure with moderate hunger, and food insecure with severe hunger. And what we can see is that the first 2 measures appear to decrease right at 2008, which is the beginning of the Great Recession. And so it appears that food insecurity for older workers did go up. And this is documented in other studies, but it's kind of the starting off point for my empirical work. So what I'm essentially going to do is look at the effects of Social Security benefits on food insecurity in this period separately from this period. And the prediction is that it's going to be larger during a downturn. All right, so empirical objective is stated empirical strategy. What I want to do is essentially map out by age levels of food insecurity and map those as smooth functions of age, but then allow for discontinuities in food insecurity, both in level and in slope. So essentially a regression kink design, particularly at the age of 64. So is there an immediate bump in food security at age 62? And does the slope of in the change of food insecurity change shortly thereafter? So the identification assumption is that if people were not eligible for benefits at 62, food insecurity would evolve smoothly across these ages. And so here's just the really basic regression kink model where we have a linear trend of, so we have food insecurity on the left-hand side, and we have it as a function of age. We have a linear trend here captured by alpha 3, and then we have a discontinuous change in this in the level, as well as the discontinuous change in the slope measured by alpha 1 and alpha 2 respectively. And so if the identification assumption were true, then alpha 1 and alpha 2 would be 0. If they're non-zero, which is the hypothesis is that they are 0, if we reject it, we're going to attribute those to Social Security eligibility at the early entitlement age. All right, so the data come from the CPS. As I said, there are going to be 4 categories, the 3 measures of food insecurity, and then the one would be food secure. It's measured during the prior 12 months of the survey. If it's also measured at the household level. So one thing I have to do here is if it's a married couple, I use the age of the oldest householder for the running variable on the right-hand side. I'm going to limit the sample here because I'm imposing linearity with respect to age, so I want to restrict the age range. And so that is, I'm restricting the sample to 55 to 64. And again, I'm separating the sample pre and post Great Recession. All right, so this is the baseline result for insecure, but no hunger, separately pre-recession and post-recession. And so this is the pre-recession and this is the post-recession. The first thing is that it does show that there's a systematic increase in food insecurity during and after the Great Recession than before. The other thing to know is that if we just kind of look at an aggregate view, it does appear that the systematic differences before age 62 and after 62 are very apparent, meaning that it appears just from this graph that during the Great Recession, food security was insured due to Social Security eligibility above 62 versus just below. But what I'm focusing on here is the discontinuous decrease right at age 62. And what I find here is that, and this is just a linear fit above and below 62. What I find here and what I'm focusing on is this drop in food security with no hunger at age 62 after the recession. So the next one is the measure of food insecure with moderate hunger. And here it's a little bit stronger and more apparent. The effects of becoming eligible for Social Security on food insecurity, where again, before the Great Recession, I see no change in food insecurity at age 62. And then when it comes to insecure with severe hunger, I don't see an immediate drop at age 62, but I do see a pretty steep decline in food insecurity with severe hunger at ages 63 and 64. And so one thing that I attribute this to is that there's a mismatch between, so in the survey, you report your age at the time of the survey, which is, in this case, it would be 62, but this is actually measuring food insecurity over the prior 12 months. So this could include periods where people are not eligible for Social Security. So this is actually the first age at which people are fully eligible for the 12 months prior to the survey. And so this it seems to suggest that food insecurity with severe hunger decreases pretty precipitously when people become eligible. These are the estimates from the model. So no hunger, moderate hunger, severe hunger. This is the discontinuous change at age 62, and then this is the change in the slope. And these largely confirm what I showed in the previous slide, which is a drop for immediate drop for no hunger and moderate hunger, and a change in the slope of 0.5 percentage points per age for severe hunger. So by age 64, it's predicting that severe hunger drops by 1 percentage point, which if I go back to this previous slide, the base is 5 percentage points of overall food insecurity with severe hunger. So a 1 point drop is a solid amount of relative to the level. All right, so I do some other things in the paper. I look at the results separately for not married versus married, and the results are coming entirely from not married households. So these results during and after the Great Recession are only coming from single householders. They're also apparent at all levels of education, so this does not appear to be kind of a socioeconomic status impact. It's actually across all levels of education to some degree. And it's among not married householders, the effects are largely coming from widowed householders versus not married, not widowed householders. And so I'm just going to show you those results for widows here. This is the result of food insecurity with no hunger. We see the drop during and after the Great Recession, right at age 62. We see both change in the level as well as the change in the slope. So this does appear to be kind of pretty apparent. And when I look at insecurity with moderate hunger, same thing, we get a pretty apparent drop in food insecurity right at age 62. And then the last figure here is food insecurity with severe hunger. And again, it doesn't show right at age 62, but there is a clear difference in the slope right after 62 in terms of food insecurity with severe hunger. And again, these are just widows, and these are where the effects are coming from largely. And so the results using the model here is that there's actually a 2.5% percentage point drop in no hunger, 2.18 percentage point drop in moderate hunger, and a change in the slope of 0.8 percentage points per age for food insecurity with severe hunger. All right, so, and then I do some extensions using some longitudinal data for using the HRS. Two particular questions that can be posed are the benefit claims that we observe and the changes in labor force participation at the early entitlement age concentrated among those that are food insecure? If that's true, it would be suggestive that the labor supply effects that we see at 62 are largely due to liquidity constraints, which would actually be welfare improving, which is not a bad thing. The second piece here is that if the relationship between widowed status and food insecurity causal? And so the question is Social Security benefits actually ensuring widowhood, consumption in widowhood, and is it different both before and after becoming eligible for Social Security? And so what I show here is a graph of food insecurity using the HRS, which is a slightly different measure than the CPS. Separately, So this is among those who become widowed, and the data are plotted by years before widowhood and year after widowhood. And this is coming after eligibility for Social Security. So what it says is that in the years leading up to becoming widowed, there's no real change in the levels of food insecurity. But once someone becomes widowed and eligible for Social Security benefits, we still see a rise in food insecurity among these households. So what this suggests is that, Social Security benefits does improve consumption due to widowhood compared to before eligibility versus after eligibility. But even conditional on eligibility, it's not fully ensuring consumption, because even after eligibility, when householders become widowed, we see an increase, a rise in food insecurity, even though they're eligible for Social Security benefits. All right, so I think these results are important for the debate on increasing the EEA. Again, they suggest large welfare gains from Social Security benefits. If you come up with a model of EEA, these welfare gains must be balanced against the revenue consequences of raising the EEA. And of course, in equilibrium or at the optimum, these should be equal. The final point I would say is that in other countries that have increased the EEA, they have targeted the EEA increase for different types of people, particularly based on the types of jobs people work in. So if it's a physically demanding job, workers are eligible for benefits earlier than people who have not participated in those jobs. And so in this study would suggest maybe a particular focus, well, there is a focus on widows and Social Security benefits, but an added focus, given that food insecurity still appears to increase among widows, even with the availability of widow benefits. All right, that is it. And then
There we go. Can you see the screen?
yeah, I can see it.
Yes. Okay, great. So today I'm going to be discussing the paper that you just saw. I'm going to give a really brief summary of the paper because I knew that Perry would do a good job presenting it. He did have a few more results than I saw in the paper, but this is kind of what was in what I wanted to focus on in what I'd read with the paper. So Perry looks at employment and he looks at food insecurity before and after age 62. And I'm especially interested in food insecurity because I think this is what's kind of new and novel about this paper. We already know a lot about employment and Social Security. And he looks at 2001 to 2007, sort of before the Great Recession, and then 2008 to 2017, which is during and after the Great Recession. And he finds that Social Security receipt at the early eligibility age decreases food insecurity. And how much it decreases food insecurity varies between 1 and 2.5 percentage points, depending on what the question is being asked and what the population looked at. Now, the bases vary from like 2.5% to 40%, depending on what the question and population asked. So these are very widely different percent changes. He finds that it decreases food insecurity, especially in the later period, and especially among widowed households. So why is this important? And as Peter Diamond reminds us, if you've ever talked to Peter Diamond about Social Security, widows are important. Like, widows are especially vulnerable, and they're people that we really need to worry about as they hit old age, and something that when we're thinking about Social Security reforms, we have to think about this population. Also, if you've ever talked to anybody about Social Security, you probably know that Social Security is either going to need retrenchment or we're going to have to increase taxes in order to pay for the baby boom population kind of filtering through. And one of the suggestions is to increase the early entitlement age. But as Perry's research shows us, this may have negative effects on food security on the extensive margin. We've also talked a lot about increasing the normal retirement age again. This would lower the amount of money that's gotten at age 62 because of actuarial adjustment, but I don't think this paper can say quite as much about that policy suggestion because it's more of an intensive margin thing rather than an extensive margin. Okay,
What's really nice about this design is that there's not much else that goes on at age 62 besides the early entitlement age. Like Medicare is age 65, the normal retirement age is later and it varies. Most senior tax exemptions, like for property taxes, are either earlier or later. Same with private pensions, catch-up contributions, and many of the other programs that we think about that affect food insecurity have much lower age limits because they're focused more on teenagers and young adults. So any kind of potential design problems with this study, for example, selection into the sample, are going to be the same before and after age 62. So they're hopefully going to cancel each other out. So this paper gave me a lot of new questions. So the first new question is why? And I think this paper may be able to say something really important about recessions. Like, is it something about recessions that is having these different results in that earlier period and the later period? And so what is it about this recessionary period? Now, in the early period, there was a mini recession. We had the dot-com bust. It was a really great time to be in graduate school. From 2001 to 2002. So we might wonder, is 2000 the right cutoff date, or should we look at 2002 as the right cutoff date? If we see that the kind of null results are stronger, if we cut off at 2002, that gives some suggestion that maybe there's something about recessions that makes the early entitlement age more important. Similarly, the Great Recession ran from December 2007 to 2014. Total employment didn't return to its pre-recession peak until 2014. So we might want to think about that higher cutoff date also. Is 2017 the right cutoff date? Should we be looking at 2014 as the cutoff date when we think that the jobless recession part recovered a bit? Although when we have recessions, the social safety net, when we have good government, the social safety net is supposed to improve. And so we're supposed to expand the social safety net during recessions. And so you might want to think about, well, what else affects food insecurity during these times? And what did the social safety net look like before and after? So, we had George W. Bush, then we had Barack Obama, various different things were going on with entitlement programs and other kinds of programs. Are there interactions that we can look at with those dates that could directly affect food insecurity that would make those two time periods different? Another big question that I had is, who are these results valid for? So there's kind of interesting, not in the HRS sample, which wasn't in the paper, but in the CPS sample, there's kind of an interesting selection into who gets into the sample. So only households who are at risk of food insecurity based on the pre-screen results are in the sample. And so that's people who are either 185% of the poverty line, or they don't have enough or enough kinds of foods to eat, or they report having run short of money and trying to make food or money run further. This is not a problem with internal validity, because we have this before and after age 62 thing that helps with internal validity. But this selection question is important for external validity. And so who is the average or marginal person in each sample? Is it different before and after in the earlier period and the later period? How does it compare to the entire CPS? Does how they got into the sample change over those two time periods? And how are these different groups affected by social safety net programs differently? So you might think that someone who's below 185% of the poverty line has a lot of access to different kinds of social safety net programs, whereas someone who's had an immediate problem maybe only has access to food banks. For some back of the envelope suggestions, Perry did some of this in his presentation, but in the paper, it would be nice to see a few more ways to think about the magnitudes, like the percent changes for the different groups, the numbers of the people in the United States who are affected by each group. That could just give you sort of, when you hear a number like how many millions of people is this, that can help you give an idea of how big these changes are. And who is being affected most, among the most vulnerable in terms of things besides just widowhood. It also would be interesting to compare the employment results for the subsample to those for the entire CPS. What would the food results look like if they were weighted that way, or if they were just weighted that way for less educated samples only? And what can you say about one of the suggestions to not increase the EEA for some groups? So for example, you were talking about not increasing it for widows. In the paper, you also mentioned not increasing the EEA for people who have histories of physically taxing jobs. And in the CPS, you might have some idea of who had a physically taxing job previously. And so you might be able to do some back of the envelope calculations for what the welfare gains for that group would be. So in conclusion, really great paper, very important results, and I look forward to seeing the next iteration. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So it looks like we have about 7 minutes left. Of course, we are running up against the time constraint, but I don't see any questions in the Q&A. So if you're here and you have any questions, you can post them in the Q&A. Just write who it's to and then the question. I know Joanna has a question, so you want to go first?
Sure. I have a question for Gary. So the more that I think about my question, the more that I think that it actually goes in the opposite, the direction that helps you, that your results might be underestimates. But one of the things that I was thinking about as I was looking through your cohorts is that the selection into who is less educated changes a lot for Black Americans during these time periods. Because many of them are like Brown versus Board of Education, at the very least, affects some of these earlier cohorts, and then all the other civil rights things. So it's selecting who only gets who is able to become a doctor as opposed to who only gets a high school diploma. And so I was wondering if you had thought about that. And I think as I'm looking at your results that it actually like helps your results. But what are your thoughts?
Well, the answer is yes, I've thought about it. It's complicated. It gets back to one of Damon's points that was really important, which is that, this is essentially identified by race, by cohort effects. But these cohorts, the older and younger cohorts had different early life experiences. So the 45 to 61-year-olds in 1980, yeah, those individuals grew up, they came of age pre mid-60s civil rights changes, whereas the younger cohorts came of age after that. We know from work by Bill Evans and his co-authors that high school completion changed in a way that varied with the entry of crack into different markets. So there's a lot going on there. We spent a lot of time thinking about that and decided at the end of the day we didn't have a very good way of addressing any differential selection into education, and so we kind of punted on that. But I think it's a really important point. As you say, Joanna, it helps us for the older cohorts. It helps us. It goes the opposite way for the younger cohorts because of some of the results that Bill had. But we don't have a good answer for that. But I think it's really important. It's a really important point. Perry, there are a couple of questions for you in the Q&A. I don't know if you saw.
Yeah, no, I just saw them. Okay, so Cecilia Conrad asks, were there changes in delivery of food stamps and food and surplus food over time? I'm actually gonna punt on this question because, like, in terms of food stamp policy, I will admit I'm not an expert, and I'm a student of food stamp policy right now. So if you have any suggestions of ways food stamps were being delivered. I know there was a switch from like physical food stamps to EBT, and so if you have any suggestions for policy changes in that regard and how it relates to our results, I'd love to take those. The second one here is by Eugene. What happens to food insecurity in later years for those who take the actuarial reduction with early retirement? Could the EEA add to food insecurity in the population for any given level of total aggregate benefit? So I think what you're saying is that if I take the reduced benefit at 62, it might improve my food insecurity at 62, but I'm locking myself into a lower benefit over the course of my retirement. And so in the later years, this might actually be welfare decreasing. Is that? I think if that is the question, yeah, I think it's totally plausible. I think the limitation of what I'm doing is just identifying the causal effects at age 62, knowing that a lot of people are kind of binding at this age 62 constraint. Anything that's kind of long run, some of the figures that I showed did show that even beyond age 62, food insecurity appeared to be systematically lower, even many years after age 62, but I wasn't interpreting those as causal at all. And I think your point is well taken that, yeah, when you get to, particularly if you become widowed and then you're stuck with a lower benefit, you could imagine that the actuarial reduction could increase food insecurity, and that if they had delayed, it would have been higher. That's a great question, but it becomes much more difficult, I think, for just pure econometric identification because there are so many moving parts in that consideration. So thank you very much. Any other?
Can I make a quick comment?
Yeah.
One related to the previous question is that there is some research by David Newmark and one of his co-authors. They look at people before and after the year 2000 when the Social Security earnings test was taken away for people at certain ages, and they look at food insecurity later in life, and I think they're trying to relate that to early claiming. So that might be something that's related to bring some evidence to that question. Two quick questions. Maybe we're almost out of time, but one question for Maria was, I think another part of selection would be like migration back to the home country. And so, another question would be, does that vary by gender, or, things like deportation and things like that? Does that vary? Does that cause another level of selection? And well, yeah, I'll just stop there because we're almost out of time. So.
Shall I? So we're looking at that. So we are working to combine data from the health and retirement study with data from the Mexican health and aging study. And in the Mexican health and aging study, we can see the Mexican population that never migrated to the US, which when compared to Mexican immigrants gives us a sense of whether those who come to the US are positively selected. And we also observe people currently living in Mexico who have a history of having migrated to the US in the past. There's definitely differences by gender in the degree of selection when migrants come to the US. So men seem to be more positively selected than women. We don't have the results for return migration for this paper, but on a previous paper with Enma, where we looked at selection in terms of predisposition to dementia, we also found that those among returned migrants, men were more negatively, in this case, selected than women. So people who stayed in, compared to people who stayed in the US. I think that in both cases, this would imply that we are overstating the health of male Mexican immigrants that we observe in the United States. So it would go, it would reinforce this conclusion that we have, that there are really no health differences across genders.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I think we're getting the signal that the session is closing soon. So thank everyone for participating. Thank everyone for attending. Great to see your faces, and hope to see you guys soon.
Thanks.
Thank you for putting this together.